Eleanor Roosevelt once said, "No one won the last war, and no one will win the next." In fact, when we look at history, it is easy to see that this statement is true. Wars often leave behind ruined cities, lost lives, and economic wreckage. However, when we look at the major wars of today, a different picture emerges. This is because sometimes even countries that are not parties to the war gain significant advantages from the resulting chaos. The conflicts currently occurring in Iran have created exactly such a situation. Although Iran is at the center of the war, some countries in different parts of the world are carefully following these developments for their own strategic interests. For some, this crisis brings opportunities they have long been waiting for. Russia is at the top of this list. For Russia, now entering the fourth year of its invasion of Ukraine, the last few years have been quite challenging. In the early days of the war, many thought the operation would be concluded within a few weeks. However, the reality was very different. As the conflict dragged on, economic costs rose, sanctions intensified, and the Russian economy faced serious pressure. It was precisely during this period that the outbreak of war in Iran created an unexpected relief for Moscow. The first reason for this is quite simple. The world's attention shifted. For the last few years, Ukraine was at the center of the international news agenda. Western governments, media organizations, and the global public were largely focused on Russia's activities in Ukraine. However, with the emergence of a new conflict in the Middle East, this interest began to dissipate significantly. This situation is extremely valuable for Russia, because the reduction in international pressure gives Moscow room to maneuver. When global public opinion focuses on other developments, part of the diplomatic pressure on Russia naturally weakens. But the real issue isn't just attention, it's energy. The fundamental fuel of the world economy is still oil and natural gas. When war breaks out in an energy-critical region like Iran, markets react immediately. Investors worry about supply disruptions and prices begin to rise. This is exactly where Russia steps in. Russia is one of the world's largest energy exporters. Sales of oil and natural gas are among the primary sources of income for the country's economy. Therefore, every rise in global energy prices means more money flowing into Moscow's coffers. Moreover, this is not just a theoretical advantage. After the Ukraine war, Russia faced heavy sanctions. Western countries tried to limit Russian energy exports, and many buyers began to steer clear of Russian oil. However, global energy markets are very complex structures. It is not always easy to track where a barrel of oil comes from. For this reason, Russian oil has often continued to reach world markets through different countries. For example, Russian crude oil is first sent to another country, where it is processed or mixed with oil from different sources. It is then sold on the international market as a new product. Although the source of the product appears to have changed on paper, the economic benefit still largely goes to Russia. The energy crisis created by the conflict in Iran makes this system even more valuable. As oil prices rise, even the discounted oil Russia sells begins to generate higher revenue than in previous periods. Simply put, even if Russia still has to offer discounts, it can earn more than before thanks to rising global prices. This partially mitigates the economic impact of the sanctions. Furthermore, some countries experiencing concerns over energy supply now find themselves forced to choose between political concerns and economic needs. For a government, the ability of its citizens to heat their homes, keep factories running, and prevent power outages are critical issues. Therefore, some buyers who avoided Russian energy products in the past are now trying to access these resources again through different routes. When it comes to energy security, countries' priorities can change very quickly. That is why the war in Iran does not only mean rising oil prices for Russia. It also means new customers, more flexible trade relations, and a diminishing impact of sanctions. And this is only the beginning of the story. To understand why Russia benefits so much from the conflict in Iran, one must first look at the country's economic situation before the war. The truth is, the Russian economy has been under serious pressure for the last few years. Following the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Russia became one of the most heavily sanctioned countries in the world. Thousands of sanction decisions targeted not only state institutions, but also banks, energy companies, the technology sector, and even individual business people. The West's goal was quite clear: to make it economically impossible for Russia to sustain the war. This plan worked to a certain extent. It became harder for Russian companies to access the international financial system. Many Western firms withdrew from the country. Technology imports decreased significantly. The banking system faced severe restrictions. As a result, inflation rose. To keep price increases under control, the Russian central bank had to keep interest rates at very high levels for a long time. Yet, despite this, economic pressure continued to be felt in the daily lives of the people. Product variety on market shelves decreased. Imported products became more expensive. The cost of living rose. However, despite all this, the Russian economy did not collapse. There were three fundamental reasons for this. The first reason is natural resources. Russia possesses some of the world's richest natural resource reserves: oil, natural gas, coal, nickel, copper, gold, palladium, timber, and dozens more. Almost every strategic raw material needed by modern economies is found in Russia. This provides Russia with a major advantage. Because the rest of the world continues to need these resources, sanctions can be applied, banking transactions can be made difficult. However, for a country in need of energy, it is not always possible to completely ignore the source of the oil, especially when alternative sources are more expensive or more limited. Russia's energy exports managed to stay afloat right at this point. When official channels narrowed, alternative trade routes emerged. Oil was transported through different countries. Intermediary companies stepped in. New payment systems were developed. As a result, Russian energy revenues managed to stay at much higher levels than expected. The second major advantage was the agricultural sector. Many people see Russia only as an energy exporter. However, the country is also one of the world's largest agricultural producers. Especially in wheat production, Russia is a global leader. This becomes extremely important during times of economic crisis. Because another issue as critical as energy is food security. A country may experience energy shortages. It may lose access to certain technologies. However, if it can feed its population, its chances of survival are much higher. Russia has a significant advantage in this regard. It can feed its population largely through domestic production. It even continues to export agricultural products to many countries. This provides Moscow not only with economic income, but also with diplomatic influence. Because for some countries, access to Russian grain has become a strategic necessity. The third and perhaps most important element is the economic partnership established with China. In recent years, relations between Russia and China have deepened further. These two countries have not always been close allies throughout history. They even had serious disagreements from time to time. However, today, common interests are bringing them closer together. China has massive manufacturing power. It needs large amounts of energy to run its factories. Russia, on the other hand, wants to sell large amounts of energy. Therefore, a natural economic relationship has formed between the Iwo sides. Russia provides energy. China provides manufactured goods and technology. Both sides get what they need. For this reason, many experts define this relationship as mutual dependence rather than just a strategic partnership. With the start of the war in Iran, all three of these advantages became more valuable at the same time. Oil prices rose. Russian energy revenues increased. The need for energy in global markets became more visible. Food security concerns grew. The importance of agricultural production increased. And as China's need for energy continues, its economic ties with Russia have grown even stronger. This is why many in Moscow do not see the developments in Iran merely as a foreign policy matter. They also evaluate it as an economic opportunity. Because for the first time since the start of the Ukraine war, Russia feels that global conditions are beginning to turn in its favor. However, whether this situation will be permanent remains a major question mark. Because the fundamental problems of the Russian economy have not disappeared, sanctions continue. The technology gap is widening. The loss of skilled labor persists, and the cost of the war is increasing every day. In other words, Moscow may be taking a breath of relief for now, but this does not mean the storm has passed completely. While the war in Iran creates a breathing space for Russia, the picture for China is slightly different. The Beijing administration sees this conflict not as a way out, but as an opportunity that could accelerate the strategic goals it has been working on for a long time. Because although the Chinese economy is one of the largest in the world, it has faced serious challenges in recent years. Especially the trade tensions with the United States have begun to strain China's growth model. For years, China's economic rise was largely based on exports. A significant portion of products sold in stores around the world was produced in Chinese factories. However, recently applied customs duties, trade restrictions, and competition in the technology field have put this model under pressure. Chinese manufacturers have tried to find new ways. Some moved part of their production to countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, or Indonesia. Others began exporting their products through third countries. However, all these solutions increased costs and weakened some of the advantages China previously held. Moreover, the problem was not limited to foreign trade. The real estate sector, which supported China's growth for many years, also entered a serious crisis. The property market, once one of the strongest engines of the Chinese economy, began to slow down. During years of rapid growth, developers borrowed heavily. New projects were built. New cities were established. Massive housing projects were implemented. However, over time, demand slowed down. Debts grew. And some of the industry's giant companies faced serious financial problems. Some firms once cited among the world's largest real estate companies came to the brink of bankruptcy. This was of great importance for the Chinese economy. For millions of Chinese families, a home was not just a place to live, but also the largest investment tool. When housing prices rose, people felt wealthier. They spent more. They invested more. However, when prices stagnated or fell, the opposite happened. Consumption decreased. The tendency to save increased. Economic growth slowed down. This is exactly the set of problems China has been struggling with in recent years. In addition, the central government and local administrations carry a large burden of debt. This makes it difficult for Beijing to implement aggressive incentive policies to stimulate the economy as much as it would like. In short, the Chinese economy is not in a crisis, but it is not in its old, comfortable periods either. At this point, the war in Iran begins to offer new opportunities to China. Because Beijing's long-term goals are not just economic growth, it is also to reach a more influential position in the global balance of power. To achieve this, China has been following several key strategies for years. The first of these is technological transformation. In the past, China's greatest advantage was cheap labor. However, over time, wages rose. The population began to age, and in low-cost production, countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Indonesia became more competitive. Therefore, China chose a new path. Instead of being the world's cheapest producer, it focused on becoming one of the world's most advanced technological producers. Electric vehicles, solar panels, artificial intelligence, systems, high-tech equipment. These are the sectors Beijing has built its future upon. And today, China is among the world leaders in many of these fields. Particularly in solar energy and battery production, China's superiority has reached remarkable levels. Most of the world's solar panels are produced in China. A large part of lithium-ion battery production is under the control of China-based companies. The war in Iran increases the importance of these sectors even further. As concerns about energy security increase, countries begin to turn to alternative energy sources. As oil prices rise, solar energy becomes more attractive. As fuel costs increase, interest in electric vehicles grows. The issue of energy independence gains more importance, and China is already in a strong position in all these areas. In other words, rising oil prices do not only provide gains to oil producers, at the same time they increase demand for the sectors where China is building its future. This could help Beijing's long-term plans progress faster than expected. However, China's real big goal goes beyond this. Beijing doesn't just want to sell products, it also wants to have more of a say in the global economic system. And the war in Iran creates new opportunities for this goal as well. Developments in energy trade, in particular, bring back to the agenda a major project China has been working on for years, creating an alternative to the global dominance of the dollar. Because today, a large part of the world economy still revolves around the US dollar. Oil trade is largely conducted in dollars. A significant portion of international reserves is held in dollars. And this situation provides the United States with an extraordinary economic power. Beijing, on the other hand, has been trying for years to open up more space for itself in this system. The uncertainty created by the war in Iran and the changes in energy markets have begun to offer China unexpected opportunities in this regard. And at this very point, a much larger struggle that could affect the future of the global economy comes into play. One of the greatest advantages China is trying to gain from the conflict in Iran is actually more about how oil is purchased than the oil itself. To understand this, one must first look at the petrodollar system, one of the cornerstones of the global economy. Since the 1970s, the vast majority of world oil trade has been carried out in US dollars. If a country wants to buy oil, it must first find dollars. Therefore, countries that import energy hold large amounts of dollar reserves. Central banks keep dollars in their reserves. Companies conduct their international payments in dollars. Banks remain dependent on American financial infrastructure to access the dollar system. This situation provides the United States with an extraordinary advantage. As long as the world needs energy, it also needs the dollar. This constant demand for the dollar helps the American economy borrow at a low cost. At the same time, it gives Washington a powerful political tool. By using its influence over international payment systems, America can apply sanctions, restrict financial transactions, and create economic pressure. China, on the other hand, has long been trying to develop an alternative to this order. Beijing's goal is not to topple the dollar overnight. Chinese officials know that this is not possible anyway. The goal is more to prevent countries from remaining dependent on only a single system. This is where the uncertainty created by the war in Iran works in China's favor. As the crisis in energy markets grows, some countries begin to look more favorably at alternative payment methods. If a portion of the oil trade begins to be conducted in the Chinese currency, this would be a significant development for China. It might seem like a small change at first. However, when considered on a global scale, the results could be quite large. Because countries forced to hold Chinese currency to buy energy may eventually start shifting a portion of their reserves to this currency. Banks can develop new payment systems, trade networks can expand, and China's financial influence could gradually increase. This is exactly the fundamental logic of the economic infrastructure Beijing has been trying to build for years. First trade, then finance, then a sphere of influence. Another pillar of this strategy is BRICS. Originally consisting of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, this group began to expand over time. New members joined. Energy producers were included in the system. A structure representing a significant portion of the global population and economic production emerged. Although China does not present BRICS as a direct rival to Western-centric economic institutions, it is clear that it wants to create an alternative power center in the long run, especially for developing countries. Because many countries feel that they are not sufficiently represented within the current global system. Beijing is trying to use this dissatisfaction to its advantage, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. China's influence is growing. This is not limited to trade alone. Ports are being built, railways are being established, energy infrastructures are being financed, telecommunication networks are being created. In short, China is making its economic presence physically visible in many parts of the world. For this reason, some experts evaluate the Belt and Road Initiative not just as an investment program, but also as a geopolitical strategy. The logic is quite simple. If a country's most important port is built with Chinese loans, if its largest trading partner is China, and if a significant part of its infrastructure relies on Chinese technology, it becomes much harder for that country to completely break ties with Beijing. The war in Iran creates developments that could accelerate this strategy. Because in times of crisis, countries look for reliable partners. They look for energy sources. They look for investors. They look for sources of financing. China is trying to present itself as a stable economic partner exactly at this point. The story Beijing wants to tell is this: we do not want war. We want to trade. We want to invest. We want to build infrastructure. This rhetoric can find resonance, especially in developing countries, because for many governments, economic growth is more important than ideological debates. Roads, ports, power plants, internet infrastructure. These are concrete needs, and China is trying to show that it has the financial capacity to meet these needs. However, despite all these advantages, everything is not perfect for China. In fact, there are some serious risks. First of all, China is the world's largest importer of energy. When oil prices rise, it is one of the countries that suffers the most. While Russia gains revenue from higher prices, China has to pay higher bills. Factories use more expensive energy. Transportation costs rise. Industrial production expenses increase. This can suppress economic growth. Moreover, new problems are emerging within BRICS, because some members of the group are on different sides of the same conflict. On one side is Iran. On the other side are the Gulf countries. China, meanwhile, wants to maintain its strong relations with both sides. But as the conflict grows, maintaining this balance becomes increasingly difficult. At some point, it may be necessary to choose between the parties. This is exactly the scenario Beijing tries most to avoid. Because a significant portion of the advantages China has gained so far stems from appearing neutral. It can act like a mediator, it can move like an investor, it can be accepted as a trade partner. However, major crises sometimes make it impossible to remain neutral, and this will be one of the greatest tests ahead for China. Because being a global power does not only mean taking advantage of opportunities, it also means making difficult decisions. As the war in Iran drags on, the likelihood of Beijing facing this reality increases. So, what kind of picture emerges at the end of all this? Actually, the answer is quite clear. Russia and China may be looking at the same war, but the opportunities they see are different. For Russia, the conflict in Iran has created a breathing space that eases the pressure on its economy. Rising energy prices, increased revenues, and the world's attention drifting away from Ukraine work in Moscow's favor. Of course, this does not solve all of Russia's problems. Sanctions are still in effect, the technology gap continues to grow, and the cost of the war increases every day. However, what the Kremlin needed most right now was time, and this crisis provides exactly that. For China, the situation is a bit more complex. Although Beijing suffers from rising oil prices, it is also trying to benefit from the shift in global power balances. Increasing the use of its own currency in energy trade, growing its economic influence over developing countries, and positioning itself as a stable global actor are among China's long-term goals. However, there is an important contradiction here. These two countries are theoretically among those that could end the conflict. Yet, at the same time, they are also the ones benefiting to a certain extent from the continuation of the war. This is why, when trying to understand international crises, it is not enough to look only at the battlefield, because sometimes the most important struggles take place not at the front, but in the energy markets. Sometimes what is more effective than tanks is oil. Sometimes what is stronger than missiles is currencies and trade routes. The war in Iran is exactly such a crisis. On its visible face, there are military conflicts, but behind the scenes, much larger calculations are revolving around energy security, global trade, reserve currencies, diplomatic influence, and great power competition. No one knows for sure how the conflict will end in the coming months. But there is one thing we know for sure. The effects of this war will not be limited to Iran alone. From oil prices to food costs, from global trade routes to the strategies of great powers, its consequences will continue to be felt all over the world. And perhaps the real question is this: when this crisis ends, will there really be a winning side? Or, as Eleanor Roosevelt said years ago, will everyone have lost something at the end of the war? Thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Take care of yourselves.